Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. My name is Vanessa. I am a qualitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions. And today I'll be presenting on writing your qualitative results chapter. A few things about Statistics Solutions just before we get started. We are a full service dissertation editing and consulting company, and we provide assistance to doctoral students with their research, both qualitative and quantitative, all the way from the very early stages, so topic development through to the final defense. We have qualitative and quantitative mentors on staff, and we also have research mentors on staff to help with the various chapters and stages of your dissertation. The webinar today is going to be specifically on qualitative results. If you are looking for guidance or assistance with anything quantitative in nature or more mixed methods, we do have some resources available on our website and additional webinars that cover each of those topics. So do check us out. Sierra is on the call here, and she's going to be posting some helpful links in the chat and some resources from our website that you can refer to. After the webinar today, you will receive a copy of the recording as well as the slides in about a day or two, so be on the lookout for those. And then at the end, I will open this up for question and answer. And you should be able to submit questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom here. So feel free to pop those in throughout, and then I'll make sure to go through that at the end of the session. All right, so we can go ahead and get started. So this here is a list of the different components that you'll typically see in the qualitative results chapter. I always recommend to students before you start writing, check in with your chair or your reviewers or your program in general and just see if they have a template or a checklist of items that they would like to see in your chapter. Every school is a little bit different, so there may be components that are not included in this slide that your school is looking for, or vice versa. We may have an extra component. This is a very comprehensive list. This is a lot of what we see through working with students on what schools are looking for. So if you don't have any resources available to you or checklists of exactly what they're looking for, this is a pretty good place to start. So generally in this chapter, you're going to have an introduction, the setting, demographics, data collection, data analysis, results, trustworthiness, and then a summary section. So I'll go over each of these in depth throughout the presentation. But again, if you don't know where to start, this slide is a pretty good roadmap for setting up your results chapter. So in the introduction, just like chapters 1 through 3 in your dissertation, you are going to restate the problem and the purpose of your study. Really reorient the reader to your research questions and then preview the chapter. So when you are restating the problem and the purpose and also the research questions, you want to make sure that you are being as consistent as possible across the previous chapters in your dissertation. So this isn't where you want to get really creative and kind of change the wording around. You really want to try to just maintain that wording, maintain the language that you've already used, just to ensure there's no ambiguity in your purpose or your research questions. With the problem and the purpose, you can provide like an abbreviated version, but generally you can just copy and paste that problem, purpose, and research questions throughout your dissertation, each place where they are meant to be. With the research questions, you definitely don't want to change the wording. Those should appear exactly the same as they have earlier in your manuscript. And then as for previewing the chapter that's to come, you can just briefly provide a few transitional statements explaining what you're going to be talking about. And you can do that by listing out the section headers that will appear in your chapter. So relating back to that first slide, you might say, in this chapter, I will present some of these sections that we've talked about. So I'll present the data collection process, the data analysis procedures, and the results of my research. So that's one way that you might transition into that chapter. Next, you will go into the setting. So this is about where you conducted your research. I like to think of this section as what do the readers need to know in order to understand the results and understand the interpretation of your results. So what is the context that they might need to understand for this? Any conditions that may have impacted your research or influences that may have impacted your participants should be discussed here. Also, anything that may have impacted the interpretation of your results should be talked about here. So if you think back to your methods chapter, you've probably already talked about and established the setting of your research. But remember, that was during the proposal phase. So you may have kind of proposed what that was going to be in this ideal context, right? So when we're in the proposal, we're not really thinking about what might go wrong or what might change. So here, when you're discussing the setting, it's going to differ from how you talked about it in the proposal, in that now you would have collected the data and really gone through the process. So here you're going to talk about areas where your setting may have changed from the proposed setting. And then again, anything that may have happened that impacted things. So you'll talk about where the research was conducted and why, any of those influential factors, and then anything that may have impacted you. So one example could be if you were planning to conduct qualitative interviews in person, or maybe do some participant observations in person, but then due to restrictions from the pandemic, you were not able to do that. That may have impacted your study pretty greatly. So that is something that you might want to mention, changing from the proposal phase to the actual practice phase, right? So rather than conducting in-person observations, maybe you relied on secondhand accounts through interviews, or maybe you relied on a different type of source of data to collect that information that impacted your setting. So those are some things that you'll want to talk about here. And then next, you will talk about the demographics. So here you'll talk about any information or characteristics about your participants that are important to your setting. So again, just establishing that context for your research and your results. So here you want to think about the type of study that you're conducting. Maybe you're conducting some type of organizational study where you're looking at a particular profession. And just think about what characteristics are important for the reader to know about the people that participated. So let's say you are conducting a study of teachers. If that's the case, it may be important for your reader to know how many years that each individual had been teaching, or what their highest level of education is, or their age. Now, if you're doing a study particularly of maybe female teachers, there the variable of gender identity or sex may not be as necessary to report, because in your study it's kind of outlined that you're only going to be looking at females. So just think about what are the important factors that that someone would need to know about this group. Namely, it's probably going to be the demographic characteristics, so age, race, gender, highest level of education. Those are typically pretty important. But then just think about anything additional related to your particular research questions that may be important to know as well. Some ways that you could do this are you can create participant profiles. So having actual descriptions of each participant with their, of course, not including their name. You want to make sure that you're maintaining that anonymity. So de-identifying that information. But one way to do it is that, or you can use a table showing each of the demographic characteristics that you want to report, and then some frequencies and percents related to those demographic characteristics. Additionally, when you're doing this, you really want to make sure that regardless of how you're reporting the data, you want to make sure that you are obscuring it. So let's say you're conducting data collection at a particular school and you're looking at just the teachers in the 3rd grade. If you report your demographics on a 1-by-1, so maybe you say participant 1 was an African-American female who had worked at the school for 3 years. It may be very easy for a reader or someone who's familiar with your site, the research site, to identify that participant from those characteristics. So just think of ways to creatively obscure the data in a way that they are not identifiable. So maybe instead of reporting their exact age, maybe you report an age range or, something like that. So just kind of think through that and make sure when you are reporting these demographics, you're still thinking about protecting the participant's identity. The next section is going to be data collection. So in this section, again, you would have already outlined your data collection in chapter 3. So now you're reporting back on what actually happened. So maybe in chapter 3, you said that you were going to conduct in-person interviews, and then from chapter 3 to chapter 4, things may have changed. So here you're just reminding the reader of what changed or what you did. So first, you'll want to talk about the number of participants that you collected data from, including the location, the frequency of the data collection. So if you are doing a study that requires multiple data collection events, you just want to explain what those events are and when they happen. Then you'll want to talk about how the data is being recorded. So with qualitative studies specifically, since you're typically interviewing participants, you'll want to make sure that you mention that you are documenting those interviews in some way. So are you audio recording them? Or are you just going to take pen and paper notes? Once you do get them audio recorded, if that's what you choose to do, what's the next step to prepare that data to be analyzed? So typically that's going to be having that data transcribed. So you'll want to describe that process of getting the data recorded, transcribed, and ready to be analyzed. Then you're going to talk about how it was recorded. So you might mention the particular software that you're using to record it. Maybe that's Zoom, maybe you're just using your phone, whatever it is, you'll want to describe it. And then you'll want to highlight any variations from your original data collection plan that happened. So anything that may have changed, go ahead and let the reader know of what those changes were and how it may have impacted your results. And same thing goes with anything unusual that may have happened. So if you lost data, that's important to report, anything like that. You just want to make sure that the reader's going into your results with a very clear picture of all of the steps that happened between when you collected the data to when you generated your findings. Next, you will talk about your data analysis. So far you've set up the stage for why you're conducting your study, who you're conducting your study on, and how you collected the data. Now you're going to talk about what you did with that data. So here you want to describe the process that you use to analyze it. Typically with qualitative studies, that means that you are going to be coding the data to move from your raw text to some codes, categories, and themes. So you'll want to talk about what that process was for you. There are a number of analysis techniques that researchers use for qualitative studies. One that I see students commonly rely on is thematic analysis, but really during your literature search, when you're looking into the different qualitative methods, that's when you'll identify the best type of analysis for you. But generally, you'll want to cite the analytical technique that you're using and then describe the steps that you're taking. So it could be that you're using thematic analysis. It could be that you're maybe using an Excel sheet to just highlight similar things or similar concepts within the data, whatever that is, you want to describe the process. And then also talk about any software that you're using to aid yourself in the analysis. So some qualitative softwares that I've seen students use are In Vivo, Deduce, MaxQDA. I've also seen students use just, pen, paper, and highlighters to analyze their qualitative data. So whichever is most appropriate for your study, you'll want to talk about that and make sure the reader's understanding the process that you're going through. So really, when you start to sketch this chapter out, I recommend just putting bullet points on step by step what you did. And then once you do that, you can build the narrative around that process so that you're, having some paragraphs in this section here. Also, one thing that may be helpful to use in this data analysis section is tables. So not just telling the reader what you did, but maybe showing them. So you may have a table to give an example of some illustrative quotes that you found in the data and show how you coded those quotes. So exactly which excerpt of text was highlighted and what code did you assign that text. And then maybe even showing what codes contributed to what categories or themes that were generated in your analysis. And then lastly, in this section, you want to talk about any discrepant cases. So in qualitative studies, it is not uncommon for maybe one or two participants to have very different responses from the others. So if you are conducting a study maybe of teachers and you're wanting to look at their perception of professional development opportunities in their district, you might have 10 teachers say that they have the best school district, the access to professional development is top tier, and they're very happy with that process. And then you might have one teacher say that they haven't been able to access those opportunities at all. So that discrepant case is also important to talk about and report. We don't want to leave that out. So you'll just want to talk about how you intend to deal with those and how they're going to fit into your analysis in this section here. So now once you've done all of that, that is really setting the stage for, how you generated your results. Now you can go ahead and describe the findings of your study. So you can do this two ways. So you can either do it by research question or by category or theme. It really depends on your study and what makes most sense for your study. So, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. It's just kind of when you're reading through what sounds most logical for you. The best way to think about this is what can you rationalize? So when your readers are going through, if they ask, oh, why did you choose to report your findings by theme instead of research question, you just want to make sure that you have a defensible answer for your decision. And that really goes for everything in the dissertation, right? We want to be able to defend our choice of research method, research design, analysis technique. So same for this part here. You just want to be able to really explain the rationale behind why you did something. So, but these are the two options generally. You'll either talk about your results under the subheading of the research question or under the subheading of the category or theme. You don't want to just talk about kind of have long paragraphs explaining your results. You really want to put it underneath that theme or research question. In discussing your results, you will also bring in some participant quotes and participant thoughts. Generally, the majority of the results section should be written in your own words, but since this is a qualitative study, it's very helpful and really supplements what you're discussing to bring in those quotes and show exactly the data that contributed to your findings. So if you are doing interviews, observations, document reviews, you can bring in pieces of that data. So where it's appropriate, you can bring in quotes, you can bring in excerpts from the documents that you used, or even photographs or observations if you were doing some type of observational study as well. The rule of thumb for this is just think about, is this quote contributing to the overall meaning, or is it just contributing to the word count, right? So we don't want to just bombard the reader with quotes. We really want to pick the best quotes or the most reflective quotes of that particular theme or category. So I recommend when you are going through your data analysis, not just coding for meaning and themes, but also identifying some particular quotes that really jump out at you, things that you thought were very impactful or really get at the crux of your research question, and just setting those aside so that later on when it comes time to write this section, you can pop those in where they need to go. Typically, when I'm writing a result section, I will start off by, when I'm drafting it rather, I'll start off by naming and defining the theme or category and putting it where it belongs. So kind of outlining where they belong. And then I'll go in and I'll just put quotes that I think are important from the data under those particular themes or categories. And then once all of the quotes are in, I will build the narrative around that. And that just helps, I think, when you're writing, it helps guide you and remember, okay, what is the point of this theme? Or how does this even relate to my research? Especially when you're doing interviews, you'll probably have a lot of pages of transcripts. So it can be helpful to just really kind of set yourself up to not be too overwhelmed by using those quotes to really guide your writing. And then a little bit more on discrepant cases. So again, these are cases that do not conform to the other participants. So they're saying something different. And these are okay to include. I just want to really stress that, if you have a general theme of, going back to my example, teachers have access to professional development opportunities, you may feel that that one case is kind of throwing your theme out of whack, but it's really okay to keep that theme. What you want to do is just discuss that discrepant case in the context of that theme. So anytime where you have situations like that, just keep that conversation within that subheading to highlight any variation in experience. So you can keep that data, you can report that data, just make sure to report it in the appropriate place so that your reader is getting the full picture of that theme right in that one section, as opposed to maybe discussing discrepant cases at the beginning or the end. We want to keep it in the context of where it's occurring. And then as far as visual aids, all of these can be helpful. So tables, figures, maps, drawings, they can all be helpful in this section to really kind of just hold the reader's hand and show them exactly what you're talking about. Generally, when you use these, you just want to think about, is this a helpful tool? Is this not something that I can discuss in a narrative paragraph? And if the answer is yes, then include it. If the answer is no, then you should just go ahead and write that paragraph as opposed to providing a table. Areas where I think that tables can be helpful and figures. Tables are really helpful when you are introducing your themes. So you might have a table to show each of the themes that you've generated. You may also use a table to show which codes contributed to which themes. So you might just have maybe like a 3-column table to show codes, themes, and sub-themes. Anything that requires alignment like that, a table can be helpful. Also research questions. So if you want to show which themes are answering particular research questions, if that's appropriate for your study, a table can be used to do that also. So these are just things to consider. As far as figures go, I've seen these used to describe how you analyze your data, particularly with thematic analysis. There are figures in that original manuscript that explain the 6 steps. So that may be a helpful tool as well. And then as far as maps and drawings, if that's appropriate for your study, or you have found a creative way to incorporate that, then I think that is always great to include as well. Visual aids are very helpful. So if it's something that you feel like is adding value to the understanding, then you should include it. If you are doing a study that is grounded theory, then this may also be really helpful when you are explaining the theory that you've generated from your findings. So that's another thing to consider as well. Then the last section, so once you've described your actual findings, you will want to talk about the trustworthiness of your data. So this is where you're going to be talking about the credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Those are the typical tenets that schools will want you to talk about. Typically, you would have proposed this in chapter 3. So that is a really good starting place when you are drafting it in chapter 4. You'll want to go back and see what strategies you had said that you intended on using to ensure the trustworthiness of your research. And then here you'll want to report back on were you able to establish trustworthiness using those strategies, or did you have to pivot and use different strategies? So for example, if you proposed that you would conduct member checking to establish confirmability and maybe even credibility. Oh, let me back up actually. So member checking is one method that you can use to do that. And what member checking is that once you have your results, you give a brief summary of those results to participants and have a conversation with them about whether or not they feel it reflects their experiences. So you could have proposed that in chapter 3. And then maybe when you finally, went through your data collection and analysis, you reached out to participants to do that member checking, and maybe they did not respond, or, maybe they were in the wind, you were never able to contact them again. And that's not uncommon, that happens. So if that happens, you'll just have to identify a new strategy to make sure that you are maintaining that credibility, right? So here you'll just want to talk about what you did to do that. Some methods that you might use outside of member checking are journaling. So maybe throughout your data analysis, you maintained a journal to make sure that you were being consistent in the way that you developed codes and themes. So just thinking through some ways that you can ensure that the data is really reflecting what participants are saying, and also can be kind of confirmed in other research settings, and it might be something that others find as well. So that's what you'll want to discuss here. And then once you do that, you will finish off your chapter with a summary. So again, very similar to chapters 1 through 3. You want to provide those highlights to the reader. So what were the really high points of your findings? What did you feel contributed the most to your research questions and potentially this field of literature? You will want to talk about that. And then you'll just provide a transition to the next chapter. So you might say something like, these findings will be further discussed in chapter 5. And that's also an important reminder too. So in this results chapter, you do not want to interpret your results too much, right? The interpretation is to be saved for the discussion chapter. Here, you really just want to present an unbiased depiction of what you found. So you're like a very matter-of-fact, participants stated X, and then providing, some illustrative quotes to show that finding. And then in the next chapter, you'll discuss how you interpret those questions and those findings based on your content expertise. And you'll also talk about the implications for practice. So how did those findings affect the particular population or sample that you're studying? And then also any recommendations that you have for future research. So those are things that you want to save and talk about in the discussion, and really not include here in this results chapter. And then just a few tips that I have for writing the results. When you think about the results chapter, you'll probably have, a lot of data, a lot of transcripts, a lot of reading to do just to analyze the data. So I always recommend start with the low-hanging fruit when you write this chapter. If you're having a day where, you feel like you just don't know where to start, or you're not in the mood to write too much, start with things that are a little bit easier. So that might be creating a demographics table, right? That information does not require a lot of interpretation. You probably know the demographics of your sample, or you've probably have it documented somewhere in your documents, whether that's through a survey or whatever it may be. So just go ahead and create that table. That is a pretty easy place to start, and it's something that you have to have completed anyways. So it is, an easy kind of thing to check off your to-do list when you're writing the results chapter. Another area that is pretty easy to do without having to dive too deep into your transcripts is that trustworthiness section. Strategies to establish trustworthiness are very well documented in the literature. So you can go ahead and, find those strategies in there and then talk about how you are maintaining that within your research and build that section out without having to dive too deep into your transcripts. And then generally, I just recommend free writing. So if you can take 10 to 15 minutes a day where you are just writing about your findings. So maybe you're just writing about a particular theme or just writing about your thoughts about what participants are saying. That can be very helpful to contributing to your overall chapter. I think a lot of times when we're writing, we feel like we need to, get down those perfect thoughts or those perfect statements. But I recommend using that free writing technique to just get down anything and then molding that into what's going to go into your chapter. Try to fight the urge to get something perfect down first, because a lot of times kind of just brain dumping your thoughts around what participants are saying can help create something that is, very informative and insightful. It just may need a little bit of molding. It might not be perfect on the first try. So use some free writing, and that's going to help just chip away at this chapter in bits, because it can be a rather lengthy chapter depending on how much data you've collected. But I am going to stop talking to open it up to Q&A. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation. So if you have started collecting data, or if you're starting to write your results, or really anywhere in the process of the dissertation, and you feel like you might need some help, feel free to reach out to us for a consultation. We would love to hear about your research and hear any ways that we can help. But I will open it up for Q&A. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put it in the Q&A section, and I'll get to those. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay too. Thank you all so much for joining today. I hope that we see you in the next webinar. Hi, Alex. Yes, you will get a copy of the webinar and the slides. And on our webinar archive library on our website, we also have slides and recordings for all of the webinars that we've given so far. So we also do one on qualitative methods. We have one on the introduction, discussion, and also defending your research. You're welcome. Have a great day. Well, welcome from Australia. Yeah, definitely rewatch at your convenience. Well, thanks for joining us too at that time. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I will go ahead and close out the webinar. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us for that consultation. We are here to help.